This video is sponsored by Squarespace. This week, my friend Brent from Goobertown Hobbies ventured all the way to my lair in the Canadian wilderness to teach me a very important miniature painting technique.
Undershot shading?
Undershot shading.
Undershot shading.
Also known as the anti-zenithal, undershot shading is a simple technique that anyone with an airbrush or a few spray cans can do quickly and easily to provide some surprisingly accurate shading to their miniatures. Today, we're going to show you how to accomplish this technique, why you might want to try it out, as well as showing you the results of our extensive scientific testing in our search to find the perfect shading color for each base color, as well as which types of paint worked best for this technique. And Brent also made a video on his channel, so you should go and check that out, link in the description. Let's get started. The basic technique is quite simple. Prime some miniatures, paint them up using whatever base colors you might want to use, but don't worry too much about the highlights or shading. Just the base colors will do perfectly fine. After this, select a shade color, load it into your airbrush, and gently spray upwards from the bottom of the miniature in a conical pattern. By conical pattern, I mean imagine you are holding a party hat like this towards the miniature, and spraying anywhere within that cone is fair game. Just try not to spray outside of that roughly 45-degree angle, and if you want, you can also add additional shading to places where the shadows would naturally gather beneath a model, such as under the armpits, chin, or between the legs. And that's pretty much it. When Brent initially pitched this idea to me, I thought, seems kinda basic. But after seeing the amazing results you can get with this and how it only takes about a minute to achieve, I have to say I am a full convert, and I will definitely be incorporating these techniques into my painting regimen going forward. I think this could be especially useful for painting armies, board games, and other large batches of figures quickly. And really the only two tricky parts about this technique are, number one, practice. I practiced this technique for many hours a day during the time of Brent's 2-day visit, and I have to say I got much better at it after just a few hours of practice. So if you do have the opportunity, I would highly recommend practicing this technique on a bunch of cheap army men before applying it to your nicer, more expensive figures. And number two, the only other slightly difficult part can be finding the right shading color for each base coat color, as not every shading color will necessarily look good on every base color. Aside from practicing this technique, this is what we spent the majority of our time researching during our 2-day paint marathon. You would assume that shading a color with just a darker version of that color would work for this technique in most cases, or if not that, then maybe a contrasting color. But in our experiments, we found that this was not always the case. In fact, it frequently was not the case. Each color really did require its own unique shading colors, not to mention that painted models often contain multiple base colors, and a single shade color might not work for all of them. So let's take a look at our experiments and the results that we were able to find. Testing army men. Before Brent left the Golden Acres of Goobertown, he was kind enough to base coat a ton of test models for us, including many army men base coated in a variety of paint colors, as well as a few actual miniatures with multiple base colors each. This gave us a ridiculous amount of test models to work with, so once again, huge thank you to Brent for doing all of that work ahead of time, and remember to go over to his channel and check out his half of this video, which I haven't seen yet. I have no idea what he's doing over there. And to start out, we used some plain white army men just to test out the technique, as well as the various shade colors we might want to use. This was our control group, if you will, and we tested out a variety of paints from a variety of paint lines on these figures, including inks, airbrush paints, transparent paints like contrast and speed paint. The inks we tried worked sometimes, but we found they were rather irregular in their consistency. They were either a little bit too liquidy, a little bit too intense, or sometimes not quite intense enough. The airbrush paints that we tried sometimes looked good, but they were often a little bit too opaque, and the shadows that they made were not quite gradual enough. We were looking for something a little bit more transparent. Overall, we found that contrast/speed paints worked best for this sort of undershot shading, as they have just the right amount of transparency, don't require any thinning before putting them into your airbrush, and you can just load in a color, spray it, rinse it out a few times, put some airbrush cleaner through it, move on to the next color. We used this method for probably 6 to 8 hours of airbrushing throughout this 2-day span, and my airbrush required very little cleaning outside of this. So I would say these types of paints are definitely our recommendation for this technique. However, while contrast and speed paint do perform about equally, speed paint is much cheaper, almost half the price of contrast paints, and it does come in dropper bottles, which I find works a little bit better. With an airbrush, your results may vary. So for these reasons, we ended up going with just the Speed Paint 2.0 line for the remainder of our tests during our 2-day research period. Our most successful shade colors were the following batch of paints from the Speed Paint 2.0 line, but for the remainder of this video, I will simply be referring to them by their abbreviated names on the screen right now. And if you look around, a lot of these have equivalents in other paint lines, so you could probably do that as well. And for the remainder of this video, I'm just going to be going through all of our test models and giving you my notes, showing you which shade I think works best for which base color. However, if you don't want to sit through all of that, or if you'd like to just have a nice visual aid to reference while you watch, you can go over to my website at howlcorp.com/undershot shading, where we have provided an entire reference document for you to peruse. And it was extremely easy to do this thanks to the hours of grueling work that Brent put into photographing and taking all the images next to every bottle of paint. Oh, and also this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform that I've been using for just over a decade now for all of my website needs. You just pick from one of their professionally designed templates, add in any pages or extras that you might like, and then customize things to your heart's content using their incredibly intuitive drag and drop grid system. No coding or technical knowledge required. I've been using my current Squarespace website for almost 2 years now to house a gallery of my painted miniatures, all of my painting reference documents, as well as my online store, and I've been really happy with the results so far. So if you need a website, why not check out squarespace.com today for a free trial? And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Dana Howl for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. Yellow. Some of my favorite experiments with undershot shading were the results from applying this technique over a yellow base coat. My two favorites were using purple and magenta to shade yellow. The purple gives a nice cool look, and the magenta gives a much more subtle and warm look, almost making the figure into a light orange. The dark red also looked quite good and is a nice sort of medium between the purple and magenta. Shading with brown also worked pretty good as well if you are looking for a more desaturated look, and shading with a dark green produced an effect that I really liked, but I'm not quite sure exactly what I would use it for. It just looks cool. And the only real loser here was shading with dark blue, so maybe don't do that, I guess. Green. Green was another color where it was very hard to make it look bad, and almost all of the tests that we tried produced good results. Shading with a darker green worked surprisingly well and is probably the standard approach that I would recommend if you want a really rich green experience. But if you are looking for a slightly warmer tone, perhaps for a creature with green skin, a dark red worked really nicely as a shade color as well. But my absolute favorite was shading the screen with a purple tone. Does it look realistic? I don't even know what that means, but it does look awesome. We also tried a brown and warm black here, and the results were both fine, but not particularly interesting to me personally. Lime green. Because Brent and I both love goblins and the lime green color in general, we thought we would try a lighter lime green color separate from the dark green tests, and I'm really glad that we did. As lime green was one of the easiest colors to shade, with almost any shade color producing an interesting result. And you'll start to notice a trend here. The lighter colors often worked best with this shading technique. We tried dark red, purple, brown, and all of these looked good, but the two standouts for me personally were magenta and dark blue. The magenta works great if you're looking for something like goblin skin, and the blue looks great for something a bit cooler like green clothing or armor. Blue. We tried a few different tests with blue, each producing an interesting and unique result, but the standouts for me were using a darker blue, which makes sense. But I also found that once again, purple was my MVP for shading blue. It produces a really vibrant result that I like quite a lot, and it makes me want to paint something with this color scheme immediately. Once again, the brown and black shades also worked for blue, but again, these weren't my favorite. Turquoise. We also did a few tests on a sort of cyan base coat, a slightly more greenish blue, and the results were unsurprisingly pretty similar to the base blue tests. Shading with green or blue both worked okay, and each emphasized more of a green-blue or more of a blue-green, but once again, purple was my favorite shade here, and we also tried shading with brown, which didn't work great as a shade necessarily for this color, but it did create a really cool oxidized metal look, which I quite liked. Purple. Although we didn't do any army men in purple, we did do a few fully painted models in purple, and we found that a dark blue worked pretty well for shading, as did a slightly darker purple as you would expect. I have a feeling that a dark red would also look really good as a purple shade, but we somehow missed that particular combo. So I'll have to try that in the future. Red. One of the hardest colors to shade for was red, as no matter what we tried, the results didn't look that different from one another. For more of a cool red, I found that the dark green looked best, and for more of a warm red, I found that purple worked great, with the dark blue shading also looking pretty okay, and the red shade basically doing nothing. Maybe we needed a slightly darker red to get results. The brown shading also worked okay, but it really just felt like a lesser version of the green shading, a little bit less saturated and vibrant. Orange. Orange was extremely fun to shade for, and my two favorites were using purple and dark blue to shade orange, with the dark red and brown shadings also working pretty good, but not being as remarkable to me personally. Khaki. For shading off-white or khaki, I think that the brown is probably the best result overall, with warm black being an interesting alternative if you're looking for a slightly cooler result. Shading with a dark blue also produced an interesting result that I do think looks good, but it definitely shifts the color into not being khaki anymore. Tan/light skin. We did a number of tests on this tan light skin sort of color, and I thought the two main winners if you are looking to shade this as a skin tone were Speed Paint Ruddy Fur and the Liquitex Ink Burnt Sienna. As previously noted, the inks were a little bit hard to work with, but we couldn't find a good color match for this exact tone in any of the other paint lines, so we thought it was worth mentioning Burnt Sienna as an ink. And here is a non-Army Man example of shading this sort of skin tone with Ruddy Fur if you were curious. I think it looks quite good. Shading with brown also worked pretty well if you're looking for a slightly darker skin tone or using this color for non-skin related applications. And speaking of non-skin related applications, if you do want to shade this color and not have it look like skin, perhaps for clothing or armor, I think the complementary color of dark blue worked pretty well here for that. Dark red was also an interesting option to use in combination with some of the other shading options to maybe add a bit of warmth to the skin, but might be a little bit too saturated to use on its own unless you're painting something like Nurgle Demons where you really want that unearthly fleshy look. Brown/dark skin. For shading brown, I thought that dark blue produced a really interesting result, although if you're using it for a skin tone, I would recommend perhaps adding just a touch of red, magenta, or purple shading to complement the blue. The purple shading on its own was maybe a little bit too saturated for skin, and the same with the magenta, but again, you can see how this would work really well if used more sparsely to add warmth in combination with another shade color. Dark red and a darker brown also worked well for shading brown, as you might expect, each one giving a slightly different look, one a little bit warmer and one a little bit cooler. And I think a warm black would have worked well to shade brown as well, but that was one option that I think we missed. Silver. You didn't think we were going to stop at just ordinary colors, did you? Of course, we had to try shading metallics using this method. For shading silver, we found that brown and warm black worked best for most applications, depending on whether you want a more warm or a more cool look. For polished metal like a magic sword, we thought the dark blue could also be an interesting option, and aside from these, we also tried a purple and a dark red, both of which looked cool but are maybe a little bit situational for things like Necrons or Chaos Space Marine armor, as it does tint the color quite a bit, and I feel like any saturated colors would honestly look cool to shade silver, but it will definitely take on that color and not really look like silver anymore. Gold. For shading gold, we found that the purple looked good if you are looking for a nice saturated fantasy gold, but maybe is a bit too purple for some people's liking. Shading gold with green, meanwhile, produced a really cool tarnished gold like you might find on an ancient skeleton's armor. And when you combine these two together, purple and green, you get a more balanced gold look. Shading gold with a warm black gives a slightly more grimdark look if that's your thing, and shading it with red is perhaps one of my favorite options, giving a really nice saturated fantasy gold like you might find in a horde of dragon gold. Brown also produced a really nice, simple, realistic gold look, and overall I think the red and brown were my two favorites for most use cases. Conclusions and overall favorites. As we kind of expected, the two most versatile shading colors which worked for the largest amount of situations were brown and a warm black. Depending on whether you want a warmer or a cooler shade, between these two you could shade almost anything, and if you have a lot of different colors on your model, one of these might be the way to go. However, that doesn't mean that brown and warm black were my favorite two shading colors. That honor goes to purple, as it works really well in a lot of situations. There's really only a few colors it looks bad on, in my opinion, and it provides such a fun, saturated look that has both warm and cool elements, depending on what colors you spray it on top of. I hope you enjoyed our extensive testing and maybe even feel inspired to test out this method for yourself. Thank you so much to Brent for driving all this way to do these paint tests with me and make these videos, and once again, make sure to go and check out his video over on Goobertown Hobbies, his channel, and probably you should go subscribe there while you're at it, if you haven't already. Thank you once again to all of our generous patrons for keeping this channel running. Your direct support really helps a lot with larger, more ambitious videos like this. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.